Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we have yet another 3D printer review. Today we're looking at the Alfawise U20 from GearBest. Firstly, big thanks to GearBest for sending me this printer to review. Full disclosure, if you do purchase this printer through one of the affiliate links in the description, I do receive a small portion as kickback. So thank you if you choose to do that. That helps support my channel. So my main 3D printer has been having problems lately, and this has forced me to actually give this printer a good run for its money with some real print jobs. And I've actually been really impressed. Now, I'll say straight away, I've done some real work with this printer, but this is not a professional printer. It is most definitely still a hobby grade printer. That is not to say that it's a bad printer. In fact, it's incredibly good value. I'm going to be hard pressed to make this video sound unbiased because I'm so incredibly impressed with what this printer delivers for the money. For starters, this printer has a massive print volume of 300 by 300 by 400 millimeters high. It's the biggest print volume of any printer I currently own. It also has a heated bed, which is something that some of the budget printers are lacking. It has a filament runout sensor, which the firmware works perfectly with. It also has power fail resume on the main controller, another really great feature that also works. I tested it. So there's a whole heap of good features this printer offers, and the price is under $300 US. Quite amazing. You may not have heard of Alfawise. This is actually GearBest's house brand. This printer is not made by GearBest. They are made by a third-party company, but they are reselling this printer and providing support and selling this printer as a package. This is the first Alfawise printer that I've tried using, and I've been really impressed with it so far. I've had this printer for a little bit more than a month now, and I've used it for quite a few projects, including my recent video. If you're a subscriber, you will have seen this, where I demonstrated a magnetic bed, a really cheap magnetic bed solution for these kinds of printers. So I'm breaking this review up into three main parts. In the first part, I'll be going over the design of this printer, showing you the features and the different aspects of it. In the second part, I'll be going through the experience of using this printer and how it's been for me. In the third part, will be a summary where I basically share my overall conclusions with you about my printer and give you my recommendation. It's actually working. That's amazing. I didn't even level the bed. Okay, so onto the review. So, talking about design. Now, I'm sure everybody has heard about the Creality CR10 or the Ender 3, or even the TiVo Tornado, and these printers have really set the benchmark for what is expected from a budget printer. Compared to something like the ANET A8 with the acrylic frame, these aluminium extrusion frames are incredibly stiff. The frame in this printer feels incredibly strong and all the pieces fit together out of the box really well. I was actually able to put the pieces together and start a test print, and it worked out of the box without even needing to do bed leveling. The stiff frame and the rigid precise construction had retained the factory calibration even though it had been fully disassembled. So I was very impressed to see how good the tolerances are on the manufacturing. All of the screws fit perfectly. I had no difficulty assembling everything. So overall, 10 out of 10 on the build quality and construction of the printer. The printer's moving parts all move along on these rubber wheels which ride along grooves in the extrusions. This is known as a V-slot system. I was really skeptical this would work well, but it's actually a system that's been very, very well tested with the CR10 and Ender 3. Both of those printers have shown that you can use these rubber wheels quite successfully and get really good quality prints out of them. All the parts move very smoothly. There's no significant play in all of them. It's a cheaper solution overall. There's something like linear rails and linear bearings. You're basically getting your motion system and your frame all in one part with these aluminium extrusions and those rubber wheels. This stuff you can buy for I think $5 a meter. It's incredibly cheap, and this means you have an incredibly strong frame, but it allows you to buy a printer at its incredibly low price. These wheels are a very low cost solution, but they do need to be set up correctly to work well. It's very important that these wheels are properly tensioned so there's a good solid grip on the frame. That prevents parts from wobbling too much. However, if they're over tightened, these rubber wheels will deform and they'll have a much reduced lifespan. To tighten or loosen these, the grip of these rubber wheels, in every set of wheels gripping the frame, there is an eccentric nut. And what this means is, with an eccentric nut, when you turn the nut itself, the position of the wheel will move closer or further away to a surface. And this allows you to adjust the tension of the rubber wheels gripping the frame on all the different axes. I've had several 3D printers that have come from the factory with linear bearing systems, which are supposed to be a superior system. However, those printers have come with really dirt cheap bearings that are grinding, that are shaking, that are shuddering. And overall, I would prefer this system for a beginner level printer. For a professional level printer, I would say that this roller bearing system is not adequate. It will not give an extended lifespan. You will have to replace these roller bearings over time because they will wear out. They are, after all, rubber riding on metal rather than a normal bearing, which is a metal on metal system. So the bed on this printer is quite large, so it's important that it is well supported. The bed on the printer rides on 6 of these rubber wheels, and there's actually very little play or flex in this bed. I did have to tighten the bed belt on this printer when I got it, and that improved the sharpness of some of the corners. The X-axis on the printer is also pretty good. We've got 3 rubber wheels that support the head on the aluminium extrusion. I did also have to tighten up the belt on the X-axis, and that also improved the print quality as well. Now the Z-axis on this printer is actually a little bit interesting. It's got these 2 thick 20x40 aluminium extrusions with rubber wheels that ride on both sides, but there's only one lead screw. So this entire gantry system is raised and lowered from one side. Now this seems super sketchy to me, and I'm surprised it works as well as it does, but it does work. This is actually the same design as used on the CR10 and the Ender 3, and well, they seem to get away with it, so I can't complain too much here. This is definitely one of those trade-offs you get when you get a super budget printer. They could have added another lead screw on the other side to make sure things never became wonky. However, that would result in additional cost on bearings, on supports, on a lead screw, on a motor, on assembly. All these things add up. So it's just one area where they've cut a corner and they've managed to get away with it fairly well. So there you go. As long as you're aware of what you're getting into with a budget printer, I see no problem with buying one. That's just one example I'd like to point out. There definitely is an art to be able to cut away the superfluous and excess parts to get the minimal set of parts required to achieve a good print result. So I'm very impressed that they have made this design work well, even just with one lead screw. Finally, the extruder. Now, I am not a fan of Bowden systems. When you have your filament being pressed from one end of a tube, pushed into a tube, and then coming out of a nozzle somewhere else, within that tube, the filament is actually slightly compressible. And this means there's some hysteresis and there's some oozing and you get all kinds of issues. So up until now, I have not really been a fan of Bowden systems. This printer is making me change my mind. I'm surprised. The Bowden system is really short, first of all. So there's only about a 25-30 centimeter tops, probably 25 centimeter length of Bowden tube between the extruder and between the nozzle itself. It's a really nice short system. What this means is there's a really good responsiveness between the motor and what's coming out of the nozzle. When the extruder motor stops turning, there really is very minimal oozing out of the U20. So I've been really impressed with this short Bowden system, and I say impressed even in comparison to other printers with a direct drive extruder. Now I have a JG Aurora A5 which has been modified to replace the Bowden tube with a direct drive extruder, and the results I get off that printer, I haven't tuned it fully yet, but the results I get off the U20 actually beat that printer in terms of stringing and oozing at this point in time. By turning on retraction to about 6 millimeters, I get really good clean results out of the U20. I get really good detail, even on the benchy text on the back of the benchy, which is something that most printers will do poorly at. This printer delivers really good, accurate control of filament. The stiff frame and the short Bowden tube together result in really good control of extrusion, and it shows in the print quality you can get out of this printer. The cooling fan of this printer also seems to work reasonably well, and I was able to get a really good result with bridging tests on my multi-part tester. Now the electronics for the Alfawise U20 are all housed in this separate control box. Personally, I prefer it when the printer has all the parts in one, but having it out to the side does make it easier to access for maintenance and servicing. However, the result of this is that there's a lot of cables coming between the control box and the rest of the printer, and this printer does look a little bit like a spaghetti monster with all these cables hanging out the back of the control box. This is an area I think could be improved. The cable management on the U20 is fairly limited and fairly basic. In particular, there's very little strain relief on these cables. What that means is, while the cables themselves are protected, it's the points where the cables join at components that is not protected from strain or flex damage. As parts move around, there are various parts that will flex backwards and forwards. Here, the cable is attached to this Bowden tube, and that prevents severe back and forward motion from occurring at this point here. That's what's known as strain relief. However, on the bed, we don't have that. The bed cable is free to move around, and as the bed moves backwards and forwards, there's a lot of flexing that occurs directly at this junction. Over time, with lots of bed movement, say you're printing a large part and lots of bed movement occurs, it is likely that the cable actually will break over time at this point here, where there is the most bending. For this reason, it would be really nice if there was a modification you could print for, say, a drag chain or a cable snake to protect the cables during this motion. It's one area I think this printer is let down by, because it will limit the lifespan of the cables on this printer, because they are flexed and bent backwards and forwards repeatedly because of the lack of strain relief. Now inside the control box, you'll find the main power supply. This is a 24 volt 10 amp power supply, which means you have 240 watts at your disposal. Now 240 watts sounds like a lot of power, but it's really not for a printer this size. It's not just the motors and the extruder heater, it's actually this big bed heater that requires most of that power. 240 watts is the lowest I've seen for any printer of this size bed. In fact, the JG Aurora A5 uses a 300 or 350 watt power supply for the same size bed. This results in fairly slow times for the bed to heat up. I took about 23 minutes for the bed to go to 85 degrees Celsius, and the very hottest I could get the bed to go was about 90 degrees Celsius. So you may find that limiting with some materials getting them to stick. I did have good results, however, with ABS, PETG, and with PLA, of course. Now my experience with this printer has been nothing short of amazing. Putting everything together, everything just worked out of the box. So from a beginner's perspective, I'd say this printer is fantastic. Firstly, I was really impressed with the documentation that this printer came with. All printers come with files on their SD card, but this printer has come with a full color, multiple page, very clear English printed book. It shows you step by step what you need to do to get started, and I think this is fantastic. This is what beginners need to get a good experience with their first printer. The English in the manual is quite good, and it was a nice experience to be able to complete the entire installation without having to go and grab a laptop and have a read through some on-screen manual. Having an in-the-box manual was a really nice touch. Also in the box, there was a good range of accessories. There was, of course, the default set of hex keys. Hex keys are an essential 3D printer tool to tighten up all the different bolts and nuts on the printer. This printer also came with a USB card reader, micro SD card, and a strangely completely blank, unlabeled micro SD card. I don't like micro SD cards, they're quite fiddly, and personally I would have preferred if the printer used full-sized SD cards. To put the SD cards in the printer, there's a small, hard to access slot on the side of the printer, and then you have to click the micro SD card inside. It goes in fairly deeply, so it's not the easiest to access, but it does work. Also in the box, there was a paint scraper. Now this is a tool I'll come back to in a moment. This one is quite sharp. And very nicely, I was really impressed to see this, was a good set of side cutters. Side cutters are a tool that every 3D printer person needs to have in their toolbox. You're cutting filament, trimming wires, cutting support materials off parts. Side cutters are an essential part. If you don't have one, I've put a link where to get some in the description below. Also in the box were an acupuncture needle. Now this is not just about trying to inspire you to try some traditional Chinese medicine. This is a useful tool for unblocking the nozzle if it does get blocked. The diameter of the needle matches the diameter of the nozzle. You can put that up there to help dislodge any component that's got stuck. Also in the box was a double-ended spanner. Now this is useful for adjusting these eccentric nuts to help tighten or loosen the rubber wheels as they run along the rails, and also the other end is smaller for adjusting the nozzle on the printer for removing or replacing that. So that's everything that was in the box. Now this printer has some nice convenience features too. It includes a filament runout sensor. This detects if the filament runs out, puts the head, parks it over to one side and pauses the print for you so you can reload a new spool of filament. I've tested this feature and it does work well, so thumbs up for that. The second smart feature this printer has is power resume. If the power goes out during a print, the electronics will save the print position so that when the power comes back online, with one touch you can resume the print. The bed and the nozzle will heat up again, the X and Y axes will home to get an accurate reference point, and the print will resume off from the last layer it was printing at. I've tested this feature and also it works well. So the bed in this printer is nice and flat. Even when heated, I did have good success with printing large surfaces and getting good bed adhesion across the whole print surface. This plastic coating on top, this is a metal heat bed with a glass sheet, and on top is this PVC sticker, kind of like a build tack-like material. You should be aware that this surface is a consumable. Over time, as you remove prints and scrape things, you will damage this material and it will require replacement. When I used this print surface, I found that PLA and ABS stuck down very well. Perhaps the temperatures I was using was too hot, but I did often find it quite difficult to remove the prints because the bed adhesion was that good. Now there are other bed surfaces out there that actually work better than this material. One example is the Ultra Base material used by Anycubic, which is also known as the Diamond Bed Coating by JG Aurora. That surface has a glass sheet with a coating on it. When hot, plastic sticks really well to that surface, but when cooled down, the parts will pop off or be very, very easy to remove. That's quite a nice solution. And it would be nice if they came with a more advanced bed surface on this printer. My biggest concern with this bed material is not from the material itself. Parts stick down well, and it's good that they don't pop off by mistake. However, because parts stick down so well, it encourages you to use this tool. I'm not going to say don't use this tool, but be extremely careful. Never ever push towards your body part or any other person nearby. If you are pushing towards yourself and you slip and this goes into your hand or into your arm, you can do serious damage to nerves and tendons. It's just not worth it. If you have kids around, make sure they understand the dangers of this tool as well. Be really, really careful with this tool is my biggest advice to you. Personally, I really prefer other bed materials that do not require a severe prying to remove them. Now on Facebook, there's actually a really good support group for the Alfawise U10 and now U20. There's actually a new printer that's just been released, the U30, which has a slightly smaller print volume, and you can get support for this entire family of printers in that group. There's people who are providing great advice and great help, and I definitely recommend the group as a positive place to be. Now there are also some official Alfawise representatives. They are fairly active in the group and they do post firmware updates about every month or so, so that looks like it's been promising too. Speaking of firmware, the firmware for the U20 is proprietary. Now this is disappointing for someone like me because I love to tinker and play with things and see what else I can add to the printer. However, I will say that the firmware does work. All the features the printer promises, like print quality was good, the power outage feature worked fine, the filament sensor worked fine, all the main features worked. And that was important to me because some printers have proprietary firmware and then have features not work. And that means there's nothing you can do about it. This firmware did work with this printer, so it gets a thumbs up from me. However, that does mean that it is limited to what the firmware developers decide to add. Say I wanted to add mesh bed leveling, I can't do that with this printer because the firmware is proprietary. Say I wanted to add an auto bed leveling sensor, again, I can't do that because the firmware is proprietary. You are limited to what the firmware developers decide to offer or not. With this firmware, you're dependent on Alfawise to fix firmware bugs and also to add new features. Not that there were any firmware bugs that I noticed in my testing. One annoyance I found was that the filament load feature on the firmware was very slow. It's much faster to insert the filament yourself, release the drive gear and push the filament all the way down the Bowden tube yourself, rather than use the filament load feature on the firmware. However, this is only a minor annoyance and not a major showstopper. However, if this firmware had been open source, this is something I could have fixed myself, without needing to ask Alfawise about it. Now this printer during operation is neither really quiet or really loud, it's somewhere in between. The rubber wheels mean that the motion of parts are near silent. The only real noises you will notice are the motors as they whir around, and also the fans, which are fairly loud and noisy. Here's a recording of this printer in action. For printing on the Alfawise U20, you have two options. On the side, there's a micro SD card slot where you can load G-code files onto a micro SD card. There's also a USB port. This USB port is a great feature because not only can you print directly from a computer via Cura or Simplify 3D, it means you can also set up a Raspberry Pi or another device to actually act as a print host. And that might mean you can print via Wi-Fi using a Raspberry Pi with Octoprint. So this USB port is a nice feature for adding flexibility to this printer. Have you believe? Okay, so let me try to sum up my thoughts on this printer for you. Overall, this is an amazing value printer, but it is still a budget hobby printer. What that means is this printer offers some amazing features like the filament runout detection, the power outage resuming, the frame is really stiff and rigid and I really like that. The print quality this printer delivers is far better than the price tag would have you believe. It's got a huge print volume. That's great if you want to print like large cosplay masks or really large car parts or whatever you want to do. It does have a heated bed, which cheap printers sometimes cut corners on. It is easy to use. It worked for me out of the box. It has a good documentation. There's good customer support. All the boxes are checked here for what's needed in a basic printer. So overall, this is a great beginner's printer. I sound like I'm raving about it because I'm so shocked at what they were able to deliver for such a low price. The downsides of this printer are the cable management. These cables are really messy. Strain relief is another point. Like I mentioned, some of the strain relief on the bed, I'm concerned that over time these cables will fail with extended use of this printer. And those are the things that make this printer not be a professional class printer because that will limit the lifespan of this printer. These are cheap printers and you will have to expect they will have a limited lifespan unless you're prepared to service and maintain them. Most of the issues on this printer are just corners that were cut to make this printer meet its aggressive price point. I don't fault them for this, and as long as you understand that this is a budget printer, you're going to have a great time with this printer. This printer delivers on what it says on the tin, and I'm satisfied that I can recommend this printer with 2 thumbs up. So what is my final thought on this printer? I would say this printer is definitely beginner approved especially. The low price is great. If you or someone else is not really sure whether or not 3D printing is a hobby you want to get seriously into long term, but you just want to give it a go. There are definitely cheaper options out there, but in my opinion, those cheaper printers often compromise on parts that will significantly impact the experience you have. They might have no heated bed, or they might have a cheaper motherboard, or they might have some unsafe construction features. And those things I would say are non-negotiables. This printer has everything I think you need in a beginner printer and nothing more. In summary, I give the Alfawise U20 2 big thumbs up for value. As long as you know what you're getting into and you understand that this is still an ultra budget printer, I think you can have a lot of fun with this machine, and I think it's a good choice for a beginner in particular. Well, that's all I have for today. If you're interested in checking out the Alfawise U20 or its baby brother, the Alfawise U30, I've put some links in the description below where you can buy it from. You may also like to check out my channel. I've got other reviews including the JG Aurora A5 and the brand new JG Aurora A5S, and they might be good comparison points to this printer. For those of you who watched the video the whole way through, thank you for your time and happy printing.